So I have a somewhat narrow definition of anime as a animation practice coming out of Japan, generally starting in the 1960s out of television animation. So in some ways there's like the wider definition where everything animated moving from Japan is animation. I tend to want to historicize it more and say that it's a style mostly pioneered by television animation of a kind of reduced movement and reduced number of drawings, a sort of economization of movement, and also a sort of serial format that comes out of television format. So yeah, so essentially a animation style coming out of Japan and starting in the 1960s that emerges, and obviously we call something like the Conan series films anime as well, because they also come from a television format, or but then Miyazaki films, it's a big question mark about whether the Miyazaki is the most well-known anime auteur in a sense, but he doesn't want to call his work anime, and he thinks it's anime is for him a somewhat degraded form. He prefers the term manga eiga, which is cartoon film in a kind of traditional sense. So so that's sort of how I see anime and some of the, I guess, the tensions around the definitions itself. It's hard to make a definition that's hard and fast, but I think the way I think about it most is a sort of exaggeration in terms of movement, as sort of still movement. So the sort of stop images were really key to animation. The way the sound will carry the image more than the movement on screen does. So in a way, animation comes a lot from the sound performance or voice performances of the actors and actresses, and that actually substituting for a movement of the image is a great kind of way to tell if something is sort of the anime style or not. And I think there's a kind of aesthetic of relative planarity, flatness, because not as much attention is paid into sort of creating the sort of three-dimensional effect. And I guess especially today, it's a contrast between 3D animation and the really cell-style 2D animation, which is made with computers mostly, and sometimes even 3D, in origin, but it's processed to look like sort of 2D cell-shaded flat style of image making that we associate with television animation. So yeah, it's tricky, but I think Miyazaki really considers his films like the manga eiga because they deal with depths in a different way than anime does, and I think for him it's an issue of the style of animation. So he's a kind of an animation purist where he wants the fullest possible movement, which is a really strong lineage that comes in part from Disney and the way the Toei studio in the 1950s really takes up the Disney ideal and turns that into aesthetic practice that they almost feel is an ethical practice of image making. I guess the media mix is a term that's a useful way to say something like franchising. What we say is franchising. So it's the way that there's never one text or one thing in isolation, that there's always a sort of connectivity between them. And when I started the research project, I was calling it seriality, because I didn't know what else would be a better word, but there's sort of a serial quality that's not only within a television show, but from television to comic to animation character to toy and so on. And so that sort of transversal movement across media is what is known as the media mix. Mm-hmm. And media mix is the sort of Japanese term that is used to describe it. And then again, it's something we might call franchising, though franchising I think often can denote more of like a film, a series of films or something alone, which it's always sort of more than that, but yeah. Here I also think the media mix really starts with Tetsuo Naotome in a way, because it sets up the economic model for animation production. And the reason why I call my books anime as media mix is because anime becomes a kind of central mechanism that holds it together, the other parts of the media mix. And Tezuka decided to basically sell his animation episodes to the television station at a price below the cost that it actually cost for him to make them, necessitating another form of income. And so the media mix, in a way, is a substitution for the income lost from selling the in a sort of base way, the episode at a higher or lower price rather than it cost for him to make it. And it borrows from other fields, and Disney is especially a big one here. So as much as we could say Astro Boy started the media mix process, it also drew on the franchising that's already been done in like Walt Disney. It borrows a contract that was used when Disney licenses characters for use in Japan, so there is that sort of material or legal history behind there. But it did create the sort of mechanics. And I guess another thing to note is the sponsorship structure of television, where at the time you only had one sponsor of a television program. Now we have multiple. In Japan, there's multiple sponsors for each program. The sponsor for Astro Boy was a chocolate company that then went on to sell the Astro Boy image, or sell its chocolates using the Astro Boy image, or Astro Boy and the other Atom friends. And so that became a really important way in which the image multiplied, kind of jumped out of the television screen, is the way it's often described at the time, and into other products, candies especially, and other animations that came after. Tetsuo and Atom also were heavily indebted to the candy makers, and so it was the kind of battle between candy makers based on who could use which character to get more sales. But that sets up this sort of system where there's always an outside to the animated text, and in fact there's always a kind of pre-outside by the manga, which is generally what the animation series is based on. So I guess it's a question of the serialization that comes from first comics, then into animation, and then across other media forms. I think in a way it became a system that is somewhat reproducible, and I think the fact that it benefited multiple players, so it benefits the TV stations, they get content. It benefits the producers in a way that this is a way to hedge some of their bets in terms of the cost structure. It eventually becomes a production model too, and I think this is something that interests me, and there hasn't been enough work on, is the production committee system, which is the Seisaku Iinkai, which if you look at the end of any anime today, they usually have the da-da-da-da-da Seisaku Iinkai, right? So the production committee, which is generally a group of music companies releasing CDs, book publishers who maybe own the original rights to the manga and want to sell more. Sometimes the Dentsu or Hakuhodo, which are the major advertising firms that are basically mediating the production of content. And so there's a way in which the system has internalized it into the very production model. So they're producing it as a media mix to begin with. And in a way, people have criticized the media mix for sort of becoming a rote pattern of spinning off products, right? That everything becomes a spin-off because it has to be a spin-off from the beginning to the end. And I think that it just has become a steady source of income. I think with, you could say that it's started to break down in different ways, that DVD sales aren't going to carry the same weight as they used to, and there has to be sort of different models of production that are thought of. But so far it's retained enough kind of importance to actually, yes, continue moving on or turn. Well, I guess the best way to answer is, so one of my first research questions was sort of why is there always this serialization, and where does this infinite serialization come from? Sort of where historically, and sort of as you're asking too, like why is it continued, and sort of what informs it? So what kind of transformations took place that created this system? And so in a way, I stopped being able to see anime as simply an aesthetic form, but had to see the sort of mechanics behind everything that went into its production, or the reasons why it was never a self-contained form, but always a sort of dispersed one. And I think, at the time there was a lot of inspiring work on anime, but from a much more narrative or aesthetic standpoint. But there wasn't much explaining sort of the industry mechanics behind it, or the sort of history of the industry as it developed. And I guess another impetus is, so if anime is so integrally integrated into this media mix system, can we really discuss anime without discussing the sort of component elements of it, including manga, including the toys, and including in a way the sort of bringing of those elements into the anime style itself. So I began to see anime style as a way of animating still images and sort of creating connections within the medium to other media outside it. So you would recognize Atom because he had that still pose, and that would carry forward into the stickers. It would, work backward into the comics, and so it had this sort of rhythm or the movement to it that extended beyond the text. And so I guess this issue of the extension beyond the text is really what led me to study it as a media mix. I think anime could be studied from other perspectives, but in a way to understand how it's being produced and why it's being produced and why it takes this form, you really need to look at the sort of expanded context of anime, and that for me is the media